First and foremost, Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. You accept that fact?
Well, look, there's a large portion of the country that has issues with the 2020 election. There are still discussion about things that went on.
Large portion of the country believes in ghosts or horoscopes. I'm asking you, do you accept the results of the election that Donald Trump lost?
Well, I'm just here as an attorney representing a client, but I think the important thing is...
and I'll keep moving. I want to give you the opportunity to answer it. It's a very easy question to answer. If you can't answer it, I've got other questions.
Well, my personal opinions are rather neither here nor there. They're no better than anybody else's. But I would like the opportunity to address the latest news and anything you think your viewers would like to be interested in.
We will definitely get to that. I just want to get to a couple of these sort of straightforward premise questions. The Electoral College also voted to lock in Biden's win and Trump's loss. That was December 14th, 2020. Do you accept that as the valid final step that the Electoral College took?
Well, again, I'm here as an attorney representing a client. My opinions are no better than yours or anybody else's. I think really the point I'd like to make, if there's one takeaway here, is that on behalf of my client, Dr. Eastman, his main focus throughout his activities in 2020 was focusing on specifically on illegalities in the election, which is a related concept to fraud.
His view of the underlying issues. And we'll get to that. Like I said, we will get to that. But again, I want to lay down some of the basics, some of these questions people can or can't answer. Was it wrong for those Trump fans and now convicted seditionists to storm the Capitol and attack police on January 6th?
Oh, my gosh, certainly. Criminal activity at the United States Capitol or anywhere else is wrong. That should be an obvious fact.
Okay.
We can get by that quickly, sure.
And turning to your dealings with the special counsel, and then we'll get into the case, but what was your last contact on behalf of your client with Special Counsel Smith's office? What, if anything, can you tell us about that?
Very little. We've had some contact with the special counsel's office, over the months, and I guess, well, going before that, even to before the special counsel was appointed with the prosecutors that are working. But we have not engaged in any sort of major substantive way with special counsel. We've had a cordial relationship. I can call them. They can call me. I know some of those gentlemen before they were at the special counsel. I've gotten to know others now. It's been very respectful.
Okay. And that's interesting in and of itself. And have you received in any way either a target letter or any other communications from the office that would make you think that they're going to go forward and potentially indict your client who's co-conspirator too?
No target letter, nothing like that. And we very much hold out hope and maybe even an expectation that he will not be indicted. Our position has always been that he committed no crimes and that a full and fulsome examination of the facts will lead any reasonable observer to that conclusion, including special counsel, we hope.
Understood. Now, you're saying today that he committed no crimes, and he, first of all, hasn't been charged. If charged, he would be legally presumed innocent. And yet someone who at times has had a different view of what you just said is John Eastman. He took the position after Jan 6, and I'm going to sort of go in reverse, starting with what was kind of circulating after the actual insurrection and go deeper into it, and you'll get time. But interestingly, we have a secret email that sort of leaked where he says to Giuliani, I've decided I should be on the pardon list, if that's still in the works. And so my question for you is, which crimes do you think he was worried about being indicted for?
Oh, sure. I mean, who can even start? I mean, you remember the atmosphere in that time period after January 6th, the media speculation, the accusations going back and forth about all sorts of things. Any reasonable person under those circumstances, whether they were innocent or guilty, and particularly someone innocent, as John Eastman was, would only prudently take that step if it was available to them.
So
I don't think there's anything surprising about that at all.
You see that as kind of standard. Everybody wants a pardon. Not everyone, as you know, indeed the vast majority of people, best we can tell, who served in the Trump administration, didn't seek pardons. It would seem, especially since he's a lawyer, that he thought he had criminal exposure.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. I mean, this sort of reminds me of back when, you had commentary when he availed himself of his Fifth Amendment protection, saying anybody that does that is guilty. That was 100% wrong. And the implication, respectfully, that anyone who would seek a pardon is guilty is just as wrong.
Well, I mean, again, I'll let you respond. But the Supreme Court ruled, as you well know, that the acceptance of a pardon, which if you seek one, then you would presumably want to accept it, is itself tantamount to being guilty, that you are accepting the process and the conviction, but you're accepting that reprieve from the executive. And so someone seeking a pardon, which, again, for my viewers to know, is unusual. Most people leave government without doing so, suggests some exposure. I take your point that he has a Fifth Amendment right. He exercised it. Again, to reasonably exercise it is to say that you think there'll be a potential criminal proceeding or something that you don't want to sort of self-report.
Well, I think it's important to look at that, one sentence quote that you displayed in the context of Dr. Eastman's behavior and public posture ever since January 6th. He's appeared on multiple public fora. He's written articles explaining in detail his views. He's debated liberal law professors on podcasts. There's absolutely nothing that isn't known about his legal theories. Some people agree with them. Some people very much don't. But he's really done his best to educate the role, and we've helped him as much as we could as attorneys about everything that happened from his perspective. And all of it is completely inconsistent with any consciousness of guilt, let alone criminal activity. And I think the pardoned email you showed is very much not inconsistent with any of that.
Okay, well, that's your response on the pardon front. Let's dive in then to the night of the 6th. I kind of want to go in from, as I said, from when things went down.
Sure.
Reasonable people might debate or differ about what they thought would happen on the 6th or what their intentions were. Then the night of the 6th, you have Donald Trump himself asking people eventually, quite late, but eventually to go home. You had that terrible carnage, something that you earlier in the broadcast referred to that would be easy to condemn. And yet, secretly, late into that night, in the 11 p.m. hour, will show, Eastman was still pushing a Pence lawyer, advocating that he seek a further delay of the certification, saying, consider one more minor violation, adjourn for 10 days. This was continuing the plot to stop the certification that day after violence and now convicted sedition is what stopped it that day. How do you explain that? And if you end up in a courtroom, how do you explain that as anything other than Mr. Eastman, as the Smith charges allege, being part of the group of people who exploited the violence?
I don't think it's exploiting the violence at all. And you have to look at it in the context of everything Dr. Eastman did leading up to that point. He was always, starting from right after the election, the great champion of state legislative authority in the presidential election process. I think that was the really valuable contribution he brought to the debate. That's a neglected area of the law. They don't teach it that much in law schools. And he did a very good job of explaining that to the public and to other interested parties.
Right, but let me pin you on this. It was violence that stopped the certification that day. You don't dispute that?
Well, violence that Dr. Eastman had absolutely no part of, and any suggestion to the contrary is without any evidentiary basis whatsoever. The indictment doesn't charge that.
No one suggests that tonight. I'm just saying, in terms of the order of operations, the violence is what stopped it. And then they reconvened. Mitch McConnell, Republican leaders on the floor saying this was an insurrection. It was stopped by the violence, and now they're trying to finish it up. And his response that night was to say, let's continue to stop and delay. In other words, to be on the side of further stopping it, having that been caused by the violence. Do you see how that could be a problem for him in this case?
No, not at all. Not at all. As I said, his goal throughout this process was to have a full and fair hearing through the certification process consistent with the Constitution of the relevant issues involved in the election. It was regrettable to make an understatement that it was interrupted as it was. And if Dr. Eastman was here today, he'd say the same thing. That very much interrupted everything he wanted to see happen, just as much as it did the other side.
Right. You're making, and again, I want folks to understand this, and everyone's entitled, of course, to their defense, and he's not charged yet, but you're making the argument that whatever he advocated for, and however some of those objectives overlapped with the seditionists, he was not advocating violence and he was not using violence. The case says something different. The government alleges that both Donald Trump and the co-conspirators exploited the violence, whether or not it was caused, that they exploited it. And so he is one of the very few people, as you know, on record after the violence responding that way. Not saying, oh, that was terrible, oh, let's take a breath, okay, enough, but rather continuing on as others did that day to try to stop it. You mentioned his public remarks. I want to play for viewers. It's the first time we're airing this on The Beat. One of the ways that he's recently tried to defend this, which is saying that he was actually trying to stop a coup because Joe Biden stole the election. That's his claim. Take a look.
The narrative is Eastman and Trump tried to initiate a coup.
Trying to stop an illegal election is not a coup, but trying to thwart a coup.
That's his description. So my question for you is, he almost seems to be raising the bar on himself. Do you have to now prove that this election that Joe Biden won, that the Supreme Court affirmed that they never took any of the challenges, is itself a coup? Is that your defense if he's charged?
Well, I wouldn't have to prove anything even if he was charged, and now he's not charged. But I think our position would be that the election in certain important states was conducted contrary to the manner set forth by the legislature in its statutes. That's important, and that requirement was recently reaffirmed, even after the election, by the Supreme Court of the United States in Moore against Harper. And I think that's what Dr. Eastman is referring to there.
Well, he's definitely referring to more than that if he is claiming that this lawful election is a coup. I mean, are you saying that you kind of wish he didn't say that?
No, I think if he had another 30 seconds to explain, and maybe he even did in the rest of that interview, the point is what he's referring to there is states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and others where there were good faith, rationally based arguments that individuals such as Vice President Pence himself and his chief counsel agreed with. They didn't dispute this part. Where the elections were conducted, again, contrary to where the Constitution places the authority for setting out the manner, which is the state legislatures. It's a technical point. It requires some explaining.
That's fine.